AI agents are everywhere, automating tasks and making decisions at machine speed. But agents make mistakes. Just one rogue agent can do big damage before you even notice. Rubrik Agent Cloud is the only platform that helps you monitor agents, set guardrails, and rewind mistakes, so you can unleash agents, not risk. Accelerate your AI transformation at Rubrik.com. That's RUBRIK.com.
This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I am going to be reproposing an interview I did a couple of years ago with Walter Chaw on a filmmaker much neglected, Walter Hill. Exciting conversation about an exciting filmmaker who's crossed many genres and had a real impact on today's cinema. However, I also wanted to use this opportunity to talk a little bit about what's going on with Writers on Film, what's going on in the future, and sort of give you a little bit of an end-of-year report as well. So first of all, in terms of Writers on Film, we're approaching, or we might have, by the time you've heard this, we might well have passed our 200th episode. I've been running this for several years now. I've had the opportunity of talking to a bunch of wonderful people. My film education has been broadened and deepened in ways I can't tell you. I've been really challenged by some of these conversations in terms of going into areas I didn't think I'd ever go into, and it's just been a wholesale positive experience for me. I'm also delighted to say that I've been asked to join the Film Stories podcast network, which really takes over some of the duties that I've been doing all on my own, helping me out with the publicity, with the platform, with some of the more technical, unseen aspects of podcasting, which if any of you participate in, you'll know about. If you don't, count your blessings. It's a part of the job that is, it's not too bad. It's just faffy, let's face it. So I'm really proud and pleased to be part of that network, and I would recommend that you explore some of the other podcasts which are available to listen to via that network, and of course to read Film Stories magazine, which is still available as a print issue. There are a diminishing family of print magazines out there, so support the ones that are, rather than send tweets after the fact about how sad it is that they've folded and they've disappeared or what have you. On to slightly other matters. This year, of course, you will not have failed to notice, if you're a regular listener, that I published the Magic Hours, and an accompanying podcast, the Malick Hours, my book on the life and films of Terrence Malick. This was an achievement for me, a personal achievement for me. If you host a podcast called Writers on Film, it will be no secret that you want to join the hallowed throng of writers to put their thoughts on paper and publish them and have them out there as part of the conversation. And I was blessed to have the opportunity via one of my former guests, Patrick McGilligan, who first suggested that I pitch an idea to the University Press of Kentucky, which they accepted and which they've been thoroughly generous and supportive of all the way through. And I'm very pleased to say we've garnered reviews from Sight and Sound, Empire, The Independent, Kirkus, and a host of other publications. It's got some great coverage, and it's doing really well in terms of sales as well. So if you can pick up a copy, if you're interested, that would be great. I understand that, like this podcast, a book about Terrence Malick has something of niche appeal, but it tends to have enthusiastic niche appeal, and so I'm really pleased that the book is doing so well. And the important thing is, I think people who love Terrence Malick hopefully will get a lot from it, and people who are maybe undecided might look at him in a different way. But personally, it's been hugely fulfilling to have had this opportunity and to have done this, and so I'm really pleased with that. Other sort of matters arising, I'm also finishing a book right now, about to submit the manuscript on the films of Jonathan Glazer, so that will hopefully be coming in June of next year, tentatively titled Visible Darkness, the films and visions of Jonathan Glazer. This is a different book. It's not a biography. It is a critical study of the work of Jonathan Glazer and will include his music videos and his commercial work, as well as his short films, and, of course, extensive material on his 4 major feature films. It's been a real pleasure writing this book, and I'm very excited to have it out there. Be really interested to see what the reaction will be. As I said before, it's a very different book, both in tone and in material to the Terrence Malick book. Other things going on. Heading into the new year, I will be traveling to Tromsø, to the Norwegian Film Festival, the northernmost film festival in the world, where I will be introducing a film. It's yet to be, we're still haggling a little bit over film rights in order to get the film that I've suggested. But that will be fun to be the guest of the festival in that capacity. I've covered the film festival 3 separate occasions, so this will be my 4th visit, and it will, as I say, it will include this opportunity to present a film to the audience, and also there will be an opportunity for a Q&A session about the Terrence Malick book. The film festivals that are going to be coming up are going to be the usual round. I'm trying to keep the numbers down. Peaked the last 2 years with about 10 or 11 film festivals, which is frankly too many in a year. But I've really enjoyed them, and I've really enjoyed the people I've met as a consequence of those film festivals. In terms of the year as such, sort of looking back on it in terms of films, I was a little bit surprised when I finished my sort of Sight and Sound top 10 that I kind of struggled to find 10 films that I really thought stood out. And in the end I did, and in the end I even had a few over that I was thinking, oh well, this could have been there, and that it didn't feel to me like an annus mirabilis exactly. And yet when I read over other people's top 10s, they cogently argued that this was indeed a wonderful year for film. I think part of this is due to the fact that I'm seeing films primarily at film festivals, and so my clock is a little bit offset by that, so that people were including films like The Chimera and Zone of Interest in their top 10s, which for me had already been dealt with in 2023. That said, there have been some great films coming out in November and December after I concluded my top 10 and sent it off. Nickel Boys being one of the films that I would highly recommend if you get an opportunity to see it in a cinema near you. Okay, I think that more or less does it for me. I would like to thank you, the listener. You've been you've excelled in your arduous duty. The support I get from people on social media is amazing. Often listeners will become guests at some point, and that is always a real pleasure. People at festivals will stop me and talk to me about the podcast, and that is also one of the most heartening experiences I can have, is feeling that the podcast is out there in the world and getting real recognition. We were mentioned in the Sunday Times a couple of weeks ago. That you can't get much better than that. I'm very happy about that. Anyone who feels like mentioning the podcast or publicizing it, I'm very grateful for. If you can, please remember to subscribe, to like, to rate on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema.
Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Walter Chaw, who is the author of a new book on the filmmaker Walter Hill. The Walter on Walter, they should have, that would have been a good Faber name if it had been a series of interviews, which it isn't, but it is an amazing look at the career of, I would say, a neglected filmmaker who has spanned the decades and made top quality genre cinema. that really deserves a reappraisal, and it's got a reappraisal in the work of Walter Chaw's book. So I'm delighted to talk to him. If you enjoy the episode, please remember to subscribe, to tweet it. If you can spread it out on social media, that would be great. We're getting great numbers of listeners, and really, it's phenomenal how this podcast has grown. And it's entirely due to word of mouth and the digital equivalent of word of mouth, because we have absolutely zero advertising budget, or absolutely zero advertising for that matter. So the more you do that, the more it helps, and that way we can grow further and further. But before you, and you can follow me on Twitter, because apparently Twitter still exists, although it's getting worse every day. If you want to, if you don't already, my Twitter handle is Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
Well, I think that was what was most surprising to me about Walter Hill. As when I first started this project about 7 years ago, it was sort of spurred on by a screening on 35 millimeter of Streets of Fire that was packed. And people were super into it, and I had barely remembered the film. I think we are probably the same age. I was born in 1973, and people were super into it. I remember seeing it in the theaters. I was probably like 12 years old, something like that, and I didn't remember it being awesome. I remembered it being weird, and I kind of liked some parts of it. I thought Diane Lane was beautiful. I didn't really remember what it was about. Just maybe campy, silly, strange. I didn't, all those things. And then watching it again as a full-grown adult, I felt exhilarated. And who is this guy? What happened? This is Walter Hill. Isn't he the guy who did 48 Hours? Is what I remembered the most for. And then you start going through his filmography, and I've had that sensation that you're describing, where I felt like, well, he's had his fingers in so many things. This is the guy who wrote Alien. This is the guy who, he even did Brewster's Millions, which seems weird, and Crossroads. I remember that too. And more recently, the pilot episode of Deadwood. There was so much stuff that I couldn't reconcile, and so many things that I loved, but I never had put a name to for whatever reason. I'm kind of an obsessive cinephile, and even as a kid, I was making lists of all the Spielberg movies and all the Kubrick movies and all that, but I never did that with Walter Hill for whatever reason. And I wanted to figure that out. I wanted to figure out why he worked for me, and I wanted to figure out also why he was invisible. Why it was so easy for me to dismiss him in my mind, even though I was interested in other filmmakers that are his, clearly his contemporaries, from the 70s all the way through. So it was that, that precise thing that you're describing that made me want to launch on this project. It's even more so after I was searching around. I didn't find many, if any, other books about Walter Hill in English. And I thought, well, okay, this is peculiar too for a person with that size. He's got 24 films and, more screenplays produced, Tales from the Crypt, and all this stuff, for this guy with this kind of body of work, for him not to have any real scholarship. That was another spur for me. Like, he deserves, at the very least, somebody to document that he was here.
Yeah, absolutely. In a
significant way. Yeah.
And I mean, there are so many directors who sort of do that sort of thing, by which I mean sort of popular action cinema, and yet get much more sort of credit and time. I mean, it's sort of become very fashionable to love Tony Scott in a kind of like, Rolling Stones versus the Beatles in terms of the two Scott brothers or something.
Yeah.
But I don't think Tony Scott. I don't want to bash Tony Scott. He's great. I like a lot of his stuff, but I don't think he's had anything like Walter Hill's sort of consistency and impact.
I agree, and I've not really begun to pull many threads on Tony Scott, because I spent most of my life not liking him better of the two Scott brothers. And that's kind of changed recently. I don't know if it's the way that he died, or I don't know if I'm just getting smarter, but I've started recently appreciating Tony Scott's work a lot more than I ever used to. I used to think it was frenetic and difficult to follow, and I scoffed, but I really love The Hunger. But yeah, to your point though, there is a gap in reclamation for Hill. And, I found that people who work in Hollywood, action directors or, people like Edgar Wright, love Walter Hill. They really know who he is. They're really excited about him. A filmmaker like Lexi Alexander says that she's modeled her career in a way after him, or been compared to him throughout her career. And so, people in the industry seem to know who he is, but the general audience, the fanboys, and you can even see it in the Blu-rays and the 4K releases now, I guess, how few there were, especially 7 years ago when it first started. Now they're sort of catching up. Imprint in Australia is doing a lot of good work. Yes, they're releasing a box set this year of Walter Hill films. But prior to that, I had to go to South Korea, I think, to find a Extreme Prejudice on Blu-ray. I had to go to Austria to find a Warriors theatrical cut. He just wasn't really being pushed forward in a lot of ways. I think there are a lot of things that are missing in terms of our ability, or this generation's ability, to appreciate him as a whole. That seems to be changing. Not knock on wood. In the 7 years since I've been writing the book, a lot of the movies I've been looking for on Blu-ray suddenly started to appear on Blu-ray, including 48 Hours got a 4K release just this month, I think. So it's coming. It's coming, but it's been a long time coming for him.
Yeah, he needs his BFI season, doesn't he? He needs his this is the sort of guy that the French were always so good at sort of claiming as one of their own. And you have an interesting point in the book that he's kind of doing the opposite of that. He's taking Le Samurai, for instance, I think is the one that you bring up as the example, and sort of turning it back to its genre origins in The Driver. So I mean, it's almost as if he's just like one generation too far away to have got that treatment.
Yeah, he seems to be, and he is more popular in France. He did a graphic novel in France called Triggerman. But he seems a little bit too cerebral, almost, I think, for the general cultish crowd, and a little bit too culty for the cerebral crowd, almost. He seems constantly to be landing in this hinter space, and I think his more recent films, like The Assignment in particular, I think speaks to a little bit of tension with him, where, as it does with a lot of older directors. I think Spielberg's The Fabelmans is sort of in the same category, where directors coming towards the end of their career, their lives, they kind of want to be understood as something different than they've popularly been understood as for their entire careers. With Spielberg, despite Munich and Color Purple and Schindler's List, I think is still kind of considered to be a populist, popcorn, technically dazzling director. And he'd like to be known as something else as The Fabelmans, which is sort of an apologia for not really being able to land a sad ending. And for Hill, by the time of The Assignment, he's really talking directly about his sources. Edgar Allan Poe, he mentions Borgia, he mentions John Keats. These are the sources that I think he hopes that we've been pulling throughout the entire course of this film, which of course very few people ever were pulling out of his movies. And this is not me patting myself on the back for finding some of that stuff in there. I think it's just actually really there on the surface, but it's very easy to dismiss it, or to walk by it, because the other stuff is so great to look at. And I don't know if you've experienced this with his movies, but for me, none of his movies drag for me. They're almost over by the time I notice them. And I don't mean notice by if it's worth noticing or not. I mean notice by just register that I'm watching something. It's so effortless that I've thought about it like it's Cary Grant. Nobody ever really noticed how hard it was what he was doing, because he's so effortless in the way he was doing it. But from being a kid to now, through 30 years of watching bad action movies or bloated action movies, watching a movie like Warriors, which is, wow, it's so great, and now it's almost over. I can't believe it. It's only 90 minutes long. What's going on? I'm used to 2.5 hours of this. It's really amazing. And if you were to ask him about that, if you were to praise him for it, he's like, yeah, I never, he said something like, I just never wanted to screw around. There's no fat on any of his movies. Even Broken Trail, which is essentially 1.5 movies, it really moves. It really moves. And one of his only regrets about Broken Trail was he's like, there's too much stuff in it. There's too much sitting by the campfire conversations in it. I was like, I don't know. I kind of enjoyed sitting by the campfire with those guys, but yeah, I guess, but still Broken Trail feels like it's over by the time you're flipping the disc. So yeah,
I mean,
no, there's yeah, it makes it tough to, yeah, I don't know. I'm rambling.
No. I love it. You're not rambling at all, and it's absolutely, it's absolutely. I think he's someone who I really got the feeling from, and you quote him, you have conversations with him throughout the book, and there's this sense of like you almost want to shake him and say, stop doing yourself down, because he talks brilliantly about his films, but he has a big bushel under which the light is hidden, which is this idea that I'm a craftsman, I'm an entertainer, I just do this stuff, and I'm not, But I mean, he starts off as a writer, and that's where he makes it. He begins making his name in Hollywood, right?
That's right. He's a very good screenwriter, and he and sort of sought after very quickly. His first produced screenplay is called Hickey and Boggs. It's the only film that the actor Robert Culp ever directed. It stars he and his I Spy co-star Bill Cosby. It's one of the great LA noirs. It's super dark. I think it would fit right up in there with the Robert Altman picture with LA Gould. That's so.
The Long Goodbye.
Thank you. The Long Goodbye. I kept wanting to say The Long Good Friday. Like, that's just not right. But yeah, it fits in right with the Long Goodbye. It's super nihilistic and pessimistic about the human condition and about men's venality, about these two guys back from the war, which is a really early topic in '72, and they're losers. Their wives have left them, and these are themes that have come up, repeatedly throughout the course of Walter Hill's career. Hickey and Boggs is really a Rosetta Stone in a lot of ways, and one of those forgotten classics that's a little bit radioactive now because of Bill Cosby, but Cosby's great at it, and he actually, given all the stuff that we know about him now, plays true to type. He's vile in it, but he's the hero, and I think there's something really brilliant about that. But from there, he wrote the screenplay for he was brought in to finish the screenplay adaptation of The Getaway, the Jim Thompson novel, for Sam Peckinpah shooting down in Mexico. That was a really big moment for him as well. But anyway, yeah, he was sought after. He worked with John Huston. He did two with Paul Newman, a weird movie called The Macintosh Man.
That's the Australian accent one.
Yeah, where Paul Newman attempts an Australian accent, which he kind of gives up halfway through. It seems like, there's an interesting scene in Macintosh Man though, where it's shot in a prison, and he's meeting somebody there, the Paul Newman character, and he's reading a book, and the book is Charles Dickens' Hard Times. And, of course, Hard Times becomes the title of the first film that Walter Hill gets to direct in 1975. But, I think it's from his disappointments with stuff like Macintosh Man, The Drowning Pool, where, Hill said, I want a shot at directing. I want to do this myself. I want, control over my scripts. And so he did Hard Times. Hard Times, a bare knuckle boxing movie with Charles Bronson, in which he didn't say this, but I've heard some accounts that Bronson maybe took a swing at him, which is a terrifying thing. I mean, Bronson's a tough guy, and but he did not like how Walter Hill cut out most of Jill Ireland's part in that film. Bronson and Ireland were married at the time, and so caused a little bit of bad blood. But yeah, Hard Times is amazing. It's out of the gate one of the great debuts, for its brevity and its structure. It's tight. They're brilliant performances from not only Bronson but James Coburn as his handler, and Strother Martin.
Strother Martin, he's never been as good as he's a character actor who I love to see when he pops up, but he's so understated in this, and you have this brilliant exchange between him and Walter Hill.
Yeah, you probably remember it better than I do at this point, but it's just something along the lines of, I need 30% less. I need 30% less of this if you want to stay in this movie.
Yeah, exactly.
But,
He
but,
says
you
you can do it. You can do it anywhere you like, but if you want to actually see it in the movie, it has to be 30%.
I love it. I love that. Yeah, and Strother Martin sort of strikes me like an actor like Robin Williams or something, where he can be really, really good if you have a director who has him on a leash.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they're going to go out somewhere and be in a completely different movie than the movie that you're in. I think Strother always thought he was in the Rose Tattoo or something. But there's, I love Hard Times, and then he follows that up with The Driver, which is just kind of impressionistic and odd, and finally getting its due in the last 10 or 15 years, I think. Really beautiful shorthand, piece, another LA noir, and then hot on the heels of that astounding failure, people couldn't wait to not go see The Driver. He releases The Warriors, which is on its way to be a blockbuster bonanza, and then the plug gets pulled on it by Michael Eisner at Paramount at that time, I think, who's like, you know what, people are fighting in the theaters and people have been killed, and there's been shootings on the subways on the way to and from it that are being blamed on this movie. So we're going to cut our losses and stop advertising for this movie completely. And then we're going to pull it from the theaters after a couple of weeks. And so, what was headed to be kind of his big moment, he really gets delayed for another couple of movies, another 3 movies, until he makes 48 Hours. But that seems to be the place where he'll fell a lot, where, these movies that we look at now and say, how could they not have succeeded at the time? Didn't succeed at the time for whatever reason. 48 Hours obviously hit big, but Crossroads was a movie I didn't love initially when I was a kid. Again, I thought it was like most people did. I thought, this is a Karate Kid ripoff. I don't want to see Ralph Macchio and another person of color mentor learning how to fight, quote unquote. This is just another ripoff. But age has mellowed me or made me wiser, hopefully. And Crossroads is really a beautiful movie about fathers and mentor relationships that don't always go the way they want them to. And the charge in Crossroads about it being racially insensitive for, a white guy learning how to play the blues is misplaced. Throughout the course of the film, the Joe Seneca character, the blind Willie Brown, the mentor, tells Lightning, played by Ralph Macchio, the Juilliard snot who plays the classical guitar, tells him, you're not a blues man. You're not born into this. You don't have the same kind of sadness. And the course of the film is sort of a saddening of the Ralph Macchio character. But by the end of it, he beats the devil's, consort, Steve Vai. He beats him in a guitar contest, not by playing the blues, which he tries to do initially, but by playing Paganini, who is an Italian composer who also sold his soul to the devil, rumor has it, for his playing ability. So it's Ralph Macchio's character Lightning going back to his own roots to find the strength and the virtuosity to save his friend. So it's not about a grading or a hierarchy of music, but rather a recognition that you are who you are culturally based on how you're born, rather than how you try to put on airs. You try to appropriate those cultures, and that's a message in 1986 far ahead of its time, maybe 40 years ahead of its time. We're not even really prepared to talk about those issues well or seriously now, but it's happening at Crossroads. And that's the movie that he was filming when his father died, who was a jazz drummer and really instilled in his love of music that you see throughout his movies too. He really lets his bands wail in his movies, and set the scene. I think nothing sets the scene for a culture better than the music of that culture. But so anyway, all these movies that you feel like in retrospect should have been bigger than they were, you realize that they weren't. I mean, how does Red Heat not be a hit? How does that not hit? Well, Die Hard opened like 2 months after that. Johnny Hanson, how is that not a hit? Well, I have no idea still how that's not a hit, actually. I think the studio mishandled it. And then, all of the bile that came out after Alien 3 and Fincher was sort of spearheading a little of that campaign about feeling like being abandoned by his producers, who were Walter Hill and David Giler, who also wrote the final screenplay. But for my money, the work print of the assembly print of Alien 3 is the best of the 3 first films.
I want to come to that straight away, actually, because
Yeah.
Inspired by reading the book. I mean, I felt I knew a lot of Walter Hill, but obviously there were a few things that I didn't know, and there were a few films I didn't know or I hadn't seen. And like any good film book, this had me altering my watch list and adding stuff. So I'd never seen Hard Times, for instance.
Oh.
I watched that yesterday afternoon,
Uh-huh.
and it's an amazing movie. Why is that film?
Good.
Why is that film not better known? It reminded me of The Emperor of the North, the Robert Aldrich movie, which has a similar sort of period.
Yes. The Depression era, right? Yeah,
exactly. Which I always love looking at comparative dates. Which would be the same as today making a film about the 80s.
Oh no. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
The 70s to the 70s to the Depression is about the same as where we are now to the 80s, maybe mid 70s, depending where you place the Depression.
Sweet God. No, he'd be very pleased by that comparison. One of his huge influences is Bob Aldrich. And so, I mean, Emperor of the North is one of the great Aldrich social consciousness movies. The comparison to Aldrich is astute because I think Hill is very engaged in progressive idealism. And he would bristle at that. He would say garbage. He'd use more colorful terms. I don't know that it was ever his intent, but his eye is so clear in portraying how men are in our culture and how, they use racism and as both a way to bond each other and a way to start a fight. It's funny, I mean, my friends can say the most horrible things to me, but if a stranger says exactly the same thing to me, that, within 5 minutes of each other, we're fighting now, we're throwing hands. So it's fascinating the way that men use aggression and violence, even in friendship, to cement bonds, and the clarity of his vision and his eye to the way that all the different ways men are, and it actually comes out as empathy. It is just that. And so you have a openly gay character, which I never would have noticed when I was a kid, but I noticed now in The Warriors. You have an openly gay character in Southern Comfort, and they're both very positive characters. You have an obviously gay character in Streets of Fire, in the McCoy character, who was originally written for a man, just like Ripley was written for a man in the Alien movies. And it's Walter Hill that flipped the genders of both of those characters. And he hints around at the topic. I feel like Red Heat is almost a film about a gay relationship in its early stages, where a man mourning the loss of his partner in Russia finds a new person that he can be close with, who has sort of amplified his masculinity to an obnoxious place. The Jane Belushi character, in order to hide in a really machismo profession who he is. And it seems like a far stretch to go, but I came there after watching all the movies that came before it and watching a couple movies that came after it to say, wow, and the Assignment is a really fascinating portrayal of, with Michelle Rodriguez allowed to be the most bi that she's ever been in any movie ever, I think. She's marvelous in it. And then again, the Sigourney Weaver character in The Assignment was originally written in the source material as a man. And so this is Hill really playing around with gender and the way that gender is represented. And the whole story of The Assignment is like the story with Johnny Hansen, is that appearance means nothing compared to what you are on the inside. The Assignment was really, slammed at the time, sight out of scene. I don't think people really watched it before they began to slam it as, an ignorant film. And I think opposite, I think the trans theory is that the reality, it's not a theory, right? The reality for trans people is that they are born as they are on the inside. There's no choice involved here. They are who they are, and nothing about what they look like, nothing about their biology has anything to do with who they are in terms of their identity. That's what we're learning. That's what I'm learning. And but Hill got it already, and he was talking about it already. And for him to be sort of villainized again after Alien 3, and now again a couple of times in his career being completely villainized for a film that's actually in its way graceful.
Mm.
Is I think a major injustice in assessment of his career. Um, yeah, I think there's just a lot of misunderstanding about Walter Hill, and I think when you misunderstand Walter Hill the way that people misunderstand Walter Hill, it's easy to be dismissive or worse about him. You know, the thing that I heard the most when I told people over the course of 7 years that I was working on a book, oh, what? I'm writing about the career of Walter Hill. Who's that? Well, and then I'll start listing things. Like, oh, he's that action movie director. Like, yeah, he's one of the great action movie directors. But when you say that, I can hear what you mean when you say it.
Mm.
And you know, it's not Robert Aldrich who gave up a family fortune in order to make, you know, movies like this in Hollywood. It's Walter Hill who only makes action movies or guy flicks. Why am I interested in that? And then I have to say, well, The Warriors is actually about a girl, and Alien, all three of the first three movies especially are actually just about a girl. And the most powerful characters in the movies are generally women, and they're the ones that undergo these sort of character arcs. With Bullet to the Head, he gave us a Asian American action hero who was also a romantic lead who doesn't know kung fu. That's kind of extraordinary for American films. The things that he's able to do. He worked with both Ice-T and Ice Cube and Trespass. There's so much stuff going on. Undisputed is a movie about Ving Rhames and Wesley Snipes in the carceral state, being sort of exploited as for entertainment, essentially by the mob, and the mobsters played by Peter Falk of all people. Did you know? And it's like there's so much stuff that's going on in his movies that is shockingly current and modern, and yeah.
Kind of subversive, because you
Yeah.
are these are films which are, you know, with all the best will in the world. I don't mean to sound in any way disparaging, but this would be a film that in the 1980s I would be grabbing a 6-pack of beer and watching with my buddies, you know.
Yeah.
And then for me to be doing that and to be getting sort of, you know, not in a sort of preachy way or an overt way, but to be getting schooled on America and race and America and masculinity or America and sexuality, you know, and the fact that I'm reading your book and having seen most of these films, and I'm going, oh yeah, geez, yeah, that character is gay, and that is, you know, and that is what The Warriors is about, you know, and that is the guy in Southern Comfort, of course. And you actually you talk about the actors and their private lives as well, in terms of them being at least one of them, I think, is an openly gay actor. A time when it was very difficult to be so. So it is isn't that subversive? Is that much more subversive than the sort of, I don't know, you know, boilerplate left-wing filmmaker who we hear about it in the interviews? You know, you're going to see a film with James Belushi and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and you're getting something which is, you know, significantly different to what you expect.
It actually is subversive. You know, to your point, is remarkably subversive, but never intentionally. I don't think. I believe that, you know, for Hill, it was always, this is just the way men are. Men can be tender with each other. Men can be afraid. Men can cry. Men can rail at the heavens. And also, on the other hand, you can have, you know, your macho Tom Cody kind of guy, but the villain is going to be sort of a macho guy in a rubber overalls. And then, you know, the right choice is a sort of nebbishy guy with glasses who no one thinks is masculine, but he's got some steel to him, and he's using, you know, money in order to make his way through the world. And so these are all these different kind of men that are coalescing around a very James Dean-y kind of character, who is this woman who is also made out of steel, you know, and yeah. It's subversive as hell, and it's critical of capitalism. It's critical of all of these systems that men have put in place to advance and entrench their own power. But he's just observing the world as it is. I don't think he's making a statement. And I think, you know, you really get in trouble unless you're, you know, Faulkner or Melville, when you intentionally try to tell what you feel. You know, you intentionally try to have a message in your movies. I don't believe Hill had any message in his film, except that he wants to tell the truth. He wants to be authentic through his characters, and you know, you can see in the way that they fight. It's always, you know, everybody has a different kind of style of fighting. I go into a little bit with 48 Hours. The Nick Nolte character is a big shaggy dude, and he has big haymaker swings. And the Eddie Murphy character is this really sprightly, sinewy, strong, smart character who does those little rabbit punches throughout the course of it, and until he gets angry, and then he loses his composure, and then begins to lose the fight. But there's so much story that's told through these. There's a great hammer fight in Bullet to the Head. It's a fire axe fight, amazing fight between Jason Momoa and Sylvester Stallone, like really scary and brutal, awesome. It's proto John Wick, I think that the entire movie is. And again, another movie that should have been huge. Why isn't this movie huge? It has all the elements to be huge, and then it was just a little bit. It was like 5 years too early. Last Man Standing, I find it to be beautiful, and I think it's at least 15 years ahead of its time, and it's so nihilistic and grim but gorgeous. But yeah, there's he's super subversive, because I think even he would find it to be a surprise that his movies are being now, I think, finally considered for as progressive and interesting as they are. This fully integrated police force, this fully, there's all he wanted the main gang, the Warriors, to be an all black gang, like it is in the book. And the studio was like, as they would be now, no way, man. There's no way that they could be an all black gang. There's no way. And so he sort of compromised, and he had other gangs, and he had all this other commentary that's going on throughout the course of it. And the most venomous, dangerous person in the Warriors is always using the F pejorative for gay characters throughout the course of it. So that sort of sexuality and that gendered violence is always present in his movies. And we would look at it and say, it's easy to say, oh, we were so backwards. It was this Precambrian times. We just said terrible things back in the 80s and the 70s. Except that Hill is making these guys heroes. Rembrandt, openly gay character in the Warriors, is the person that guides them back home. Really, he's the chronicler, and he's the there's so much stuff. He's the person that saves them from the Lizzies, the all girl gang. He's the one that's not attracted to them in any way, so he's not lured in by the sirens. He's the Odysseus,
which is
hey, they're packing. He's got the wax in his ears. He's the one that sees that they're dangerous to them and saves the whole little offshoot group that he's with. He's a hero, unapologetically a hero in that movie. And who does that if you're just sort of a He-Man who truly hates weaker men? Or the weaker men in his movies are often the heroes in the movies, and that's subversive as hell, man.
It's amazing. And I do think that, you say he's not intentionally doing it, he's just looking, but that vision, there's a lot of filmmakers who don't film action movies or noirs or thrillers just as the world is. They film them in a cinematic space, which are absolutely loaded with prejudice and with biases and with so to just say, oh, this is just how, I remember there's a great part where you describe the police station in 48 Hours, and there's this idea of like, here it is. It's multiracial. It's a place where there's a large number of women working in the police force, and he just presents it as, well, this is how it is. So this is how I'm showing it. But there would be so many who would go, no, you need a black sergeant. You need right. Here we are, because I've not seen a real police station. I've only seen police stations on TV.
Right. And to your point, I think there's a certain obstinacy about Hill and his vision that has rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. I think he's gotten in trouble at every studio he's ever worked at, and because he won't compromise about those things that you're describing. People will come in with notes and have come in with notes and said, you can't do that. You can't have this happen here. You can't have this guy be the boss. You can't have this guy be the hero. You can't. And Hill's like, no, I'm just. This is the way it is, and if you don't like it, you can take my name off the picture, and I'm walking tomorrow. And he just has always had this confidence of quitting, if not as a tantrum, but as like, I know what I'm doing, and it might not agree with what you're doing, but this is what I'm doing, and even if I'm not going to articulate to you exactly the reason I'm doing it, I assure you I have a good reason for it. And I think you're right, there is intentionality here, and I think the intentionality is to be fair to all of his characters. He seems to have a real affection, with a couple of exceptions, I think, in his career, but a real affection for all the people in his movies. And you can feel that, like, for all of their faults, especially Nick Nolte in 48 Hours, I think, who he really identified with. He really loved Nick, and that you see this really flawed human being in every facet of his failure as a man, but also every facet of his success as a man too. And his desire to make amends is one of the most touching things about that film. He wants to make amends with his girlfriend, but he's terrible at it. He wants to apologize to Reggie, but he doesn't have his apology accepted. He wants to be better, but he can't be. He's stuck. And the movie really is about people being stuck. I think a lot of his movies are about people being stuck, especially men, and violent men will have violent ends, and they're doomed. They're doomed. And there's this real touchingness about it. Even at the very end of the pilot episode of Deadwood, which most people would sort of credit to Milch, rightfully so. Milch is a genius. But there's a scene where both the Seth Bullock character, played by Timothy Olyphant, and Wild Bill, played by Dave Carradine, Keith Carradine, sorry, they draw at the same time, and it's not clear who has successfully shot the bad guy. And there's sort of this brilliant, beautiful staccato exchange of dialogue that says, "Is that yours or mine?" Like, well, I'm going to bet on you. It's like, I've butchered it. It's so beautiful in the pilot. But that's a kind of writing and a kind of exchange that you find in The Driver. You don't find it in the rest of even Wild Bill's short appearance in the Deadwood series. You don't hear it there. But you do hear it in other Walter Hill places, and I think, and I know that is him. That's Walter Hill inserting himself at that moment as the screenwriter and saying, men don't have these long conversations generally with each other. They'll play video games with sitting next to each other for 8 hours and say 10 words to each other. But all of those words are full of love and admiration for one another. And how do we boil it down here? How do we capture this masculine language in a way that's also tender? And that's something I think that Hill does and has done throughout the course of his long career, almost better than anybody in American film. But buried in there might be explanation too for why his films are not more popular or celebrated, is that there's always something uncomfortable for the macho person who's going to see these movies in his movies. They're almost like autocritical of the audience. That's sort of baked in. I'm sorry I talked over you.
No, it's fine. No, it's fascinating. I was just, as you were talking, I was thinking of how, well, so many questions were coming up in my head of, so for instance, one of them is I think at the moment we have this notion of toxic masculinity, which is a little bit become something of a cliche. That there's this. But the original notion of toxic masculinity was one of sympathy. Was these guys are performing a certain form of masculinity, which is toxic, not primarily to themselves, and in that sense, using that original meaning of the phrase, a lot of Walter Hill's films, as you described them, appear to me very sympathetic portraits of toxic masculinity.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. It's a really good observation. I mean, the original subtitle of the book is the tragedy of masculinity in the films of Walter Hill, and it's now the tragedy and masculinity in the films of Walter Hill, because along the 7-year journey of this in several different publishers, I was informed correctly that nobody has any sympathy left for men in the modern space. And so, pushing a book, already kind of a tough sell with people, very few people actually really know who he is, but pushing a book that has as its aim to talk about the tragedy of being a man is a tough sell. It's a tough sell even to me as I say it. I get that. I do. Because, men would be a lot more tragic if they weren't responsible for all the bad stuff in the world. But if we can get past all of that, there's a way that we can set it aside just for a moment and say, these world-destroying men with these terrible complexes and terrible upbringings and dads that didn't love them, and this generational abuse that results in, half men like Trump and Elon Musk and what have you, all the stuff that has built these smogs, in the Hobbit sense, in the world, that is a tragedy. That is really too bad. It's too bad for the fathers who, for whatever reason, are miswired in such a way that could never express love to their sons in a way that was appropriate and healthy. And now the sons themselves who are not able to do that and have probably passed it on to their own offspring. And so there's a real tragedy for us collectively, but also for them individually as human beings, that they can only know pleasure from being humiliated. And so there's a terrible tragedy that has, their toxicity does poison them, and it does spread. It is contagious. They're not just afflicted; they're carriers of this contagion, and so we have a world that's falling down because we've allowed billionaires. And I think there's a sense that we get to with Brewster's Millions, even the outlier for a lot of people in Hill's filmography, where we talk about a guy who doesn't want office, who runs on a platform for mayor of New York or governor of New York as don't vote for anybody. All these guys are corrupt. None of the above. Vote for none of the above. And he actually wins the election. And so what does that sound like? And all of, I begin to think as I was watching Brewster's Millions that the millions wasn't referring to the money, it was referring to his followers. And we hear that now when we look at, the Georgia runoff, for instance, or even our last election, where we say, okay, thank God, but who are these 30 million people that voted for this maniac, this fascist? Are we rubbing elbows with? Those are Brewster's Millions. The people who are following obvious con men, people who are mistaking wealth for insight and for value. And I'll go on forever about this, but it goes back into the Reagan era, and all this stuff. Could Hill have been predicting all of this stuff? And no, he's not a prophet, but what he is a great anthropologist. He says, we're just sort of, a troop of shaved monkeys, and we respect the same things that other monkeys do. We respect the guy with the biggest pile of stuff, and we respect the guy who screams the loudest, and we respect the guy who's, swinging around. And so there's a real kind of clear-eyed vision of that, and the zero sum of that. If we can't achieve civilization, all we have is who we are as in our genetic makeup, if you will, as a species, not as a race. And so then you see some of the progressiveness in terms of race, how we're all kind of equal, and the racial friendships that you have in his movies and everything, because he believes we're all doomed because we're all kind of implanted with a self-destructive drug. I don't want to sound like James Cameron now in Terminator 2, but we are kind of wired for self-destruction. And if we can't get over that sort of wired in masculinity, then this is the end of it that we see. In Streets of Fire, you have the most virile guy in the movie. He has to leave, just like Ethan Edwards has to leave at the end of The Searchers, because all of the qualities that you need to build a society are unwelcome in society once society is built. Like Moses doesn't get to go to Canaan. And so there's this. All of these old stories are in his stories. The old stories of the hero that dies, and then there's the buried under 7 hills in Rome, right? To speak to your place. But there's the heroes don't actually get to participate in society, because the things that made them heroes, their brutality, their quick decision making, quick to anger, all these mythical figures, they have to leave because we're just kind of we're farming here. That's great, Achilles, but you have to die.
I mean that is what runs through the book as well. Is this and I think it's a really a fascinating insight into what makes Walter Hill such a rich filmmaker to think about. Is this he has this certain erudition which is worn extremely lightly, to the point that most people wouldn't think of it, or you wouldn't approach a Walter Hill film thinking necessarily of Homer and of all these things. And yet that is light years deeper and more interesting, more fascinating than, again, I'm not dunking too hard on him, but you bring up James Cameron and his sort of paint by numbers use of Joseph Campbell and myth and all this sort of stuff, which just in the end looks derivative. Nothing in Walter Hill looks derivative, but it is keyed into all these things which are mythical and are coming out of art, and yet even using that language, I mean, again, it's a sort of theme of the book. You're putting forward these ideas, and Walter's sort of like, well, maybe, I don't know, I don't think so.
Yeah, he is so, and that's the other piece of it, right? Because you couldn't get a camera away from Cameron or John McTiernan, or these guys are really big personalities, and they're very willing and wanting to talk about these things. McTiernan putting the ode to joy in Die Hard. There's nothing. These are maximalist filmmakers, and in a really weird way, talking about a guy who has chases involving passenger buses and trains. He's kind of a minimalist filmmaker in a lot of ways, and in the sense that you're describing, where there's so much, what was the lovely phrase you used? There's a bushel under the torch. There's so much stuff that he has larded in the underneath here, and it's not on purpose. He's not creating subtext, but there's subtext there because his sources are so manifold and stunning. The sources are stunning, and they shouldn't be, because everybody, I think, knows kind of that The Warriors is based on Anabasis, this really old story, this really ancient story about a flight from Persian and this army that's cut off from support and has to run home to the sea. I think we know that, and yet we're just thinking, oh, this is just more of the George Lucas hokum. Yeah, Joseph Campbell lived on Skywalker Ranch. It's more of that stuff. These guys that are pretending, but Hill's not pretending. He'll say those things, and sometimes he'll say them in his study, which is lined with bookshelves. And the books on his bookshelves are Homer and Herodotus and Ovid and Thomas Mann and James Dickey. And these are real books, and they're not books that an interior designer has picked for the color and the shape. These are books that have been read. These are books that have bookmarks in them. They are the basis for archetypes, like in The Driver. The characters don't even have names. This is a passion play about the interaction between men and women, and there's the player, the strongest character, the smartest character in the movie is played by Isabella Gianni, and it's like there's archetype throughout. And with the Warriors, and then the really controversial director's cut that he released of The Warriors, that I look at as an attempt to wave a hand finally and say, I know you love this movie, you guys, and I know that you get dressed up, and I know that you get together and you have a six-pack, and that's all great. That's all my intention. This is further my intention. This is, he wanted to be a comic book artist for a while. He wanted to do all these things. So these are my influences. It's these comics that I grew up with, Sergeant Furies and whatever. And there's also, the Greek myths and the Greek historians. And this is the story that I want to tell here. And there's a little bit of Shakespeare in Warriors, and there's a little bit of all of this stuff. There's music. There's R&B and in the Warriors, and there's Joe Walsh, opposite of R&B, and the Warriors too. There's all of this stuff in here. Please notice that. Please notice that. And of course, he's derided, and his own fans turn against him. Say, how could you do this to your movie? You destroyed it. How could you never, how dare you? How dare you? How dare you want to be known? How dare you want to be heard? There wasn't a lot of time taken with, why did he do that? Because it's his voice that's reading the introduction. It's his voice that's telling the story. Anabasis, it's his voice that's the narrator of that. He originally wanted that for his original screenplay, and he asked Orson Welles to do it. Yeah. He was shooting the far side of the wind, other side of the wind, I think, something. But anyway, he's really deflecting. He doesn't want to be the kind of guy that goes on about his own work as if it were more important than it is what he would say. He doesn't want to become the bore at the party. And yet through his films, I see this sort of steady progress, starting with The Warriors director's cut, but landing at a place around The Assignment and Dead for a Dollar, where he's really not desperate, but he's really like desiring of understanding, or at least a hearing in the court of critical appreciation.
Yeah, absolutely.
In addition to everything else, I was also doing something else too.
Yeah, absolutely, and deservingly so. I mean, I watched again for the first time as a result of reading your book, Bullet to the Head, and I'd always had it in my head as this was going to be a John Woo ripoff, which of course it isn't. That's my mistake. Right. It's from a French graphic novel, I think. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep.
And there's a scene in that, and it made me roar with laughter. I thought it was hilarious when the two, Sylvester Stallone and the lead actor, whose name I've forgotten, from the Fast and Furious franchise.
Sung King.
Yes, and they've got the they're doing the classic John Woo Tarantino face off guns, and Stallone just says, okay, is that enough? Because my arm's getting tired. And I just thought that was that's so many people try to have their cake and eat it and don't manage. But Walter Hill has the balls and the moxie to manage and to use this cliche and then to strip it away and that happens several times in that film. It's a really good deconstruction of that's a word he would never use, but it's a deconstruction of the action movie of the time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good observation. And he really walks a delicate line in a lot of ways throughout Bullet to the Head. You have a character in Sylvester Stallone who is, a little bit like the Nick Nolte character in 48 Hours. He's clearly racist, and still the good guy. So how do you walk the line here? I think you walk it the way that you described, is like you comment on it, you deconstruct it. You're right. He would never use that term, but that's what he's doing. He's aware of it. There's this banter that goes on between Sung Kang's character and Sylvester Stallone's character that goes sort of like, oh yeah, you Asians can't drive. Sung Kang's, oh, that again. Oh, why don't you say that I'm a dry cleaner too? Why don't you just go there? Like, there's an awareness of this generational racism that may not be based on malice, but rather is based on a system of upbringing and representation. That Sylvester Stallone's a product of the character is a product of the sort of thinking that we all had as we were growing up, throughout the course of the 80s and the 70s, where it's okay to make ching chong noises. It's okay to think these things about Asians, and some of these stereotypes about Asians are actually positive. So what are you so upset about? So having that conversation with a younger generation Asian and Sung Kang, saying, "Come on, man, are you serious?" And then that's a delicate line. How do you do that without making Sylvester Stallone the character an object of mockery or an object of hatred? On the other hand of it, and I don't believe that he's either of them by the end of it. He's just fully human. He's just a guy who does weird work, and he's got a daughter that he's concerned about, and now this guy's going to date his daughter. Is like, I don't like that, not because you're Asian, because you're a cop. And there's this really kind of delicate line that's going through this racial line that's being drawn throughout the course of the film. But at the end of it, you have an Asian American hero who's not related to a immortal dragon god or whatever, doesn't know secret kung fu. He's not like all this garbage, right? But he's just a guy who's trying to do his job and doing a different way, and he gets the girl at the end of this film. And that's, man, I don't know how rare that is for an Asian American to see in a film, especially in 2012. I can't, I would challenge your listeners to say, 10 years ago, name one film produced in the United States with an Asian American romantic lead. Yeah, rare, if not maybe The Replacement Killers, but he's not Asian American. So there's a very small, it's almost one of one for a while, that representation in that film. And it's a bullet to the head of all things, right? You're expecting, it's in this great Merchant Ivory production of, it's of the Red Cart or something. No, it's in this action movie where it's kind of buried and people are dismissing it as old Walter Hill and old Sylvester Stallone. I don't want to see that. It's dismissed offhand. Yeah. People don't even watch it. Even a fan like you.
Yeah, you're right.
It took a long time to see it.
Absolutely, it was in the Rome Film Festival. I remember when it first came out, and that was to be fair to myself. That's the only time I've ever considered going to the Rome Film Festival. I was like, oh, right. There's another couple of films I want to go into a little bit. Well, first of all, let's go back a little bit and the Alien 3 controversy, because again, inspired by the book, last night I rewatched Alien 3, the assembly cut, which you make this very bold claim for as being the best of the three, and saying it is ripe for critical reevaluation.
It's funny that you say bold because I actually made the claim to Fincher. I worked with David Fincher on a series that he did for Netflix, and we're talking about Walter Hill, of course, who had experience with Alien 3, and I said to him, I was like, the assembly cut of Alien 3 is actually my favorite of the three movies, and there's a long silence, and then he says, "Come on, Walter," so not even Fincher thinks that's a valid take. But I tried to convince him, as I'll try to convince you if necessary, that that it's the most full and nuanced depiction of Ripley in any of the films. In the first movie, she's sort of set up as the villain initially, and then at the end is sort of just a really awesome, but not terribly well developed. She's aided in the first film, I think, because there used to be like a sex scene between her and Dallas, and the Tom Skerritt character that Walter Hill and David Giler kind of cut out of it. She's really aided as being a really truly powerful character that has held up a franchise now for 50 years. But by the third one, she has lost two daughters, and she's about to lose the third one. If you remember, her daughter on Earth has aged out, and Newt, of course, dies in the crash, and then she's about to lose the third daughter, the queen that she's pregnant with, and she chooses to lose the third one. But this is a woman who's sort of been battered, and her body has been the subject several times of men's interest in terms of science and taking what's incubating inside of her. So it becomes a very fraught political allegory as well. And then it becomes a religious allegory by the third one, where she is a Joan of Arc figure. She's been shaved and she's been humiliated, and she's on this planet with other men.
And she's going to die by fire as well.
She's going to die by fire. Exactly right. And there's the scene I always point to in Alien 3 is when she's going to the mess hall for the first time for a meal, and she's looking for a place to sit. She finds a seat, and across from her is Charles Dutton's character, who says, "You don't want to sit here. I'm a rapist and murderer of men, of women." And she says, "Well, I must make you really nervous then." And she sits down. This is an extraordinarily powerful woman who, even beyond being spunky to a murderer and rapist of women, says to the Charles Dance, the doctor character on this planet, she says, "I'm lonesome. I like sex," essentially. And she's like a lot of Walter Hill's characters, like Mercy in The Wars, for instance. She's in charge of her sexuality. She wants sex when she wants sex, and she knows who she wants it from. And that's powerful and empowering. So she's that. There's a sense of doom throughout the course of Alien 3 that is not, I think, present in the other films. The first, a great haunted house movie. The second, a great squad action film, in the Howard Hawks tradition. And the third movie really is a dirge, is this sort of allegory. You're in a labyrinth with the Minotaur, and it's really shot that way at the end of it, going through a maze. And there's no out for you except the out that you choose for yourself. And so she does. She makes the decision to self-delete at the end of it. And in the assembly cut, the monster emerges and she cuddles it in a way as she's going into it. So she assumes sort of this classical pose of the Pietà. Not the Pietà, the Madonna and Child pose as she's going into the fire. This is such a remarkable archetypal resonance to it, but the movie was so derided when it came out. People hated this movie because it killed Hicks, it killed Newt. Alien cubed, that means there's a geometrically more aliens. Why isn't this on Earth? And that was Eric Red's treatment of the film, I think. Why isn't it why are there a kabillion aliens, and then there's a war against why isn't the Starship Troopers? That was the expectation, and they went entirely in the other way. They kind of went insular and introspective as a result of it. All these different kinds of men and their frustrations. The guy who's humiliated about his IQ, the sort of petty power struggles, the restriction of all of these things about men and a terminus. And you see echoes now of Alien 3 and stuff like Wild Bill and Deadwood and these frontier films about how do men coalesce a civilization on the edge of nothing, and on the spiritual edge of nothing too.
I always find it really striking in that film. I saw this film at the cinema, so a long time ago, and I've seen it several times since.
Oh,
And I always find it a brilliant move, but a sort of tragic one when Charles Dance's Clemens is killed, because
oh my God.
he is by far, the most interesting of the male characters to play opposite Ripley, and he. Not necessarily by far, because I think Dylan's an interesting character as well, and some of the others. But there's a real, because he's just said this extraordinary admission, not that he's a criminal, not that what his crime is, but that he's voluntarily stayed on this prison. And if you want a metaphor for masculinity being unable to escape its own parameters, and it's despite the self-destruction involved, there you go. I mean, how reduced and shriveled and desiccated must your experience of life be that you prefer to stay on that prison? And yet, at the same flip side of that, what extraordinary love for these ridiculously awful, horrific characters must you have to say, I wasn't going to leave them on their own without any help,
It's truly graceful.
Yes, that's a beautiful way of putting it. It's graceful.
And it's just like with Hitchcock's, surprising murders in his movies, it's really good to look at the moments right before as indicative of what, the author is really trying to say, So to your point, he's doing penance essentially on it. And then he's martyred in that moment, in a really kind of quick and senseless sort of way. It just comes down through the ceiling behind him as he's talking. And there's this sense too of like, the sort of Damocles for all of us is that, how do we want to go? We never really get to choose the way that we go out, but do we go out penitent? Do we go out as a coward? Do we go out because of a product of our choice? Or do we go out in fear and denial of that? And there's a lot of stuff that's going on in this movie that will directly and does directly offend action movie purists, quote unquote, who are looking for something else, a different kind of kink when they're going to this movie. Alien 3 is not any of those things. And I think, Hill has said before publicly, he's like, I was pretty bored by the whole concept by that time. He's just looking for a way out of it at that time. What better way to get out of it than to kill the hero of it, he thought. Little did he know. But there's a real sense of that, I think, in the film, of weariness. Of, there's a line in it too that says, you've been part of my life so long, I can't remember any part without it. And I think about that line a lot, because I deal with my own stupid trauma, my own inability to get out of my head, and my own battles with depression, and and I look at my depression sometimes, and I'm having worse of it. And I think, man, you have been here for as long as I can remember. You have been in my head for as long as I remember my parents. It's like, it's this constant companion. And so the alien becomes, for the prisoners, they call him the dragon, but it becomes like this really archetypal religious affliction in a way. It'll never go away as long as she is alive. And the real horror of the beginning of the fourth movie is this revelation that even in death she can't escape the alien. They're kind of bound together, but you get this image of all of these holy images of of Daphne being chased into eternity by Apollo, and their stone visions. It's like there's never an escaping. It's a kind of hell. And what does the alien represent? Well, it represents violence and rape too. For women, she's raped by the alien while she was sleeping and impregnated. And so, the specter of male sexual violence towards women that's, evolving throughout the course of the movie as well, is suggested to be another thing that accompanies women for their entire existence. And they can never, ever completely shake it. This malignancy of men.
It's always there as a possibility. It's always there as a, and I mean, it's exaggerated to the nth degree in that film because, she's literally on a planet of rapists.
Right. But by the same token, you have this idea too. I think that was like, I developed a different kind of empathy as I went through this process with Walter Hill's movies, for men in the past that I would have been dismissive of as irredeemable. Like in the Extreme Prejudice, you have this group of commandos that they shout terrible things at each other and hyper violent and do terrible stuff. And in the past, I would have just looked at that as sort of stock characterization of people I hated, or Southern Comfort's a better example even. And watching the movies, I suddenly am like, okay, so what happened here in Southern Comfort is you have a football coach, a high school football coach, who has never coached a winning season, but whose identity is that, who goes mad and draws a crusade cross on his chest as he's going, through the swamp, and almost as a mercy, the people that he's hunting hang him from a railroad trellis. So what's happening here? It isn't just a slasher film. It isn't just the jock and the cheerleader and the nerd. It isn't those character types. It's different. It's the man traumatized by performative masculinity. It's the guy who's traumatized as a gay man by, a man traumatized as a black man, a man who's, the story of tragedy in all the lives of these men is almost touching to me now. And I think that's something that I carry, I think, after the writing this book, is even in movies that I'm watching for other pieces I'm writing now. Like, I went back and revisited all 5 Death Wish movies and all 5 Dirty Harry movies in the last few days. And I find there to be sort of a touching dysfunction in each of those characters now. Whereas before, like, oh, cool, they're the Punisher, I like that. Now I'm thinking, what happened to them is really, truly awful. Not Dirty Harry so much, but what happens to Paul Kersey is really, truly awful. And I wonder if I would have the same kind of empathy if I wasn't sort of trained to do so now by watching Hill, who has this kind of tremendous empathy for men. Again, we don't deserve it. We're terrible. We hurt other people because of our trauma. But if you can get past that to a philosophical place where you can sort of say, to find that grace of the Charles Dance character, to say, here I am on a planet full of rapists, but yet there's something that's worth saving. And maybe through my grace, there's something that they can find in themselves too that's worth saving.
And Ripley gets to that when she saves the life of her potential rapist. There's a point where towards the end, I mean, my only pushback to your argument would be, I totally agree with you on a level of character and story, but it comes down to execution in the sense that maze at the end is, I mean, I think Fincher directs the hell out of it, but I don't think it works. I think you get to a point, it's a little bit like an underwater fight in a James Bond movie. There's just something about the physics of fighting underwater, which after 5 minutes, it's like, all right, skip to the end. Where somebody's gonna shoot a harpoon gun at somebody else. I get it. Yeah. You know what I mean? So it's just I if there's a film that they could do a special edition of, that would be it, and get rid of Skippy the Xenomorph as well. That just sort of bounces about.
I'll keep working at it. I've been bugging him about this. I was like, David, just people want this. He's like allergic to the topic, but for me, it's like, it's some of these guys don't actually know what they made. There's just, they only see what they wish they had made.
Right.
They don't actually see what they did make. And for me, yes, you're right. It's a lot clunkier technically in a lot of ways, and I think owing to overshoots and over budgets and schedules and all the stuff that was ridiculous for that team. But and rewrites on the fly too.
Right.
But there's for me, I tend to overlook that for whatever reason, because I'm so driven. I'm seduced by the undercurrents of it enough that, like many of my favorite films, I guess, they're far from perfect, but the undertow is so strong I get sucked out to sea anyway when I watch them. And I think I feel the same way about Alien 3. I can't even though I've watched it maybe like 10 times in the last few years, I can't remember what you're talking about. I do know what you mean, because I remember seeing it initially in the theater and being, oh, what is going on after Cameron? This looks stupid. This is ridiculous. Who is this guy Fincher? He'll never make it in Hollywood. But watching it now, all I can see is sort of like the beautiful design elements and the beautiful ideas that were driving all of these motions. I know that the maze probably doesn't work, but that it's a maze at all, That's amazing. That's remarkable to me. That's like, okay, so you set an alien film in a labyrinth. I know all about that myth. That's really fascinating. And that myth is also about rape, and that's also about, an ill spawned spawn and a monster that they kind of put away in a labyrinth, and it's used for a political power, centering purpose by King Midas. So there's something that's really, yeah, this is really awesome about that to me, to find it in there. That allows me to overlook some of those things. Not to say that everyone can or should, but just to say that would be my defense of it, is like, the thematic underpinnings of this are strong enough and compelling enough for me that I kind of can't remember how it doesn't work technically.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to keep on talking about all Last Man Standing. I went to the cinema 3 times to watch that film. So
bless you, bless your heart.
You're right. I adored that film. I love Dashiell Hammett, and I love Yojimbo and Fistful of Dollars.
So good.
This film has to go alongside all of them as
so good. And for what it's worth, he would love the comparison to John Woo.
Yeah,
he loves John Woo, and he was about to remake The Killer at one point. He has a script ready for it.
Wow. Well, let's
hope. Those guys, there's a mutual admiration thing going on there. It's hard to know who originated what, but he would not be displeased by that comparison, I think.
And I saw his last film, Dead for a Dollar, in Venice.
Awesome.
Yeah, and the last thing that I wanted to ask you though was what's Walter's reaction to the book been? What's the has he been has he given you any?
Yeah, he's he keeps saying I haven't read it. I won't read it. I'll never read it. I'll never read it. But I will say, I think he will. I hope he will. And I try to be fair. It's not just, I hope you back me up on this. It's not all just gushing. It's
God, no.
It's an analysis as far as I can provide one, as well as I can provide one. And it's trying to weasel out these threads that I think he's kind of left there, these crumbs that he's left there for us to find. Or the thread is good for a labyrinth analogy, right?
Yeah.
That he's left there to help us find our way out of his work. And what he has said is he did watch the episode of War on Netflix with about 48 hours.
Right.
And he initially was like, Walter, I'm never going to watch that. Good for you. Thank you. But I'm never, ever going to watch it. But his family convinced him to watch it. And he called me immediately after, it was like a Sunday morning or something. It was an off time. And I love it. But off in terms of it wasn't during business hours, in other words.
Right.
So,
okay.
He called and he said, he thanked me. And he said that it was, he's like, of course I'm the one that's being helped by this, but I just want to say, I think it's really well done and thank you. And there was a part where I talk about bridges in his movies and how they're always sort of places where things happen between characters that are significant. And there was at that point that someone said to him as they're watching, it's like, oh, well, maybe he goes a little bit too far. Surely he didn't mean that. And he's like, well, actually, for Dead for a Dollar, we went back and we did some pickup scenes so that we could find a bridge so we could talk about this relationship a little bit differently. So, that's, I think, his way of saying something to me about whether or not I was getting close to what he was working on. And he's, for as generous as he was about anecdotes, as generous as he is about his process and whatever with me, for the most part, he never really talked about what his movies are about. If I ever said, hey, did you know that you have chest opening in at least 6 or 7 of your movies? Does it have anything to do with your asthma? And he's like, so when I was walking with Bob Aldrich, and that it becomes a completely different anecdote. It's like when you're talking to David Lynch and you ask him about something, he'll talk about carving a birdhouse or some shit. So there's like this real deflection of the digging really deep. I did ask him, I said, I thanked him essentially. I was like, thank you for expanding my reading. I had not read enough Borgia. I've read all of it now because of this project. And I said, in particular, I had not read the Edgar Allan Poe essay that he references twice in his movies, and once in his movie and once in Perversions of Science. And I said, I had never read that before. The explanation that Poe gives about the Raven and why it works, and thanks for that. And is it your intention for this to be, your statement about how to look at your films? And there's just a really long, unusually long silence, and he said something like, yeah, you're the first person to ask me about Edgar Allan Poe. But then it's stunning because, and that's all he'd say, but it's stunning to me that that's true, because the Strother Martin character is named Poe.
It's Poe, yeah. And he quotes Poe in the film.
He quotes Poe. Yes, and there's a Poe, I think, in Undisputed, and there's a Sergeant Poe in Dead for a Dollar. Poe is foundational for him, one of the great American storytellers, right? One to the other. And I think that sort of is it in a nutshell. These kind of little crumbs that he gives me about this work and the process of this work have been enough for me, to sort of feel like maybe I'm headed in the right direction, for whatever that means. I mean, I could come to completely different conclusions that he ever comes to, and there's separate things. He does something completely different than I do. He makes movies, I make criticism, but for what it's worth, I think that he's glad that someone wrote 257,000 words about his career and he got to see it. And ultimately that was my only goal and only real fear about the book, was that it wouldn't come out in time. He's in his 80s now. You never know. You never know if you're in your 40s, really, right? So that became my anxiety. It's like, oh, please, let's get this out. Please, let's get it out before something terrible happens. And I have to, I have to say, 6 months later, here it is. I wish you could have seen it. So I'm just really grateful that it's there now, for what it is, and for guys like you who actually have the kind of the level of masochism to read it. So I appreciate that.
No, I mean, that's there you go. There's the masculine armor descending. There's the shell of self-deprecation.
I was raised by a really traditional Chinese dad too, so I might have a thicker shell than most in terms of that toxic layer. Yeah.
Brilliant. One last question, final question.
Yeah, please.
We always ask, and I know I don't think I prepped you for this, but I always ask for a film book recommendation, a film book that you would recommend to our listeners. And that's it. That's the final question.
Well, I mean, I guess I have two that I go back to. I want to cheat about it. I mean, I'm going to cheat this way.
Everybody does. Everybody does. Nobody ever.
This is an impossible question, by the way. Yeah. So for the technical side of it, I always recommend Walter Murch's In the Blink of an Eye. I don't think it's a surprising recommendation. It's kind of a honored text, but it's such a brilliant book, and it says a lot about. It taught me a lot about how to watch movies, and by the way that Murch puts stuff together. Murch, one of my all-time filmmaking heroes. Return to Oz, my God, what a masterpiece that was. Talk about overlooked, right? And on the other side of it, just as a movie book, it's kind of not a movie book. It's Sterling Hayden's book, Wanderer, right? Which he writes about. When he he takes his kids on a boating trip around the world, and he writes about a little bit of experience of Hollywood, but more the experience of sailing and more, evading the IRS, I guess. But it's really beautiful, rewritten. And I think that maybe not enough people know that Sterling Hayden was a gifted novelist, a gifted writer, and memoirist. And once reading it, The Long Goodbye takes on a whole nother level of significance when, that's the writer, Sterling Hayden, who walks into the ocean. He literally kind of did that, and it kind of brings depth to him turning down the Kurtz role in Apocalypse Now. All of those things are happening during the writing of Wanderer. So highly recommend Sterling Hayden's Wanderer.
Amazing. I've never read that, so I will.
It's beautiful.
That goes on my list. Thank you so much, Walter. I really appreciate the book. I really appreciate the fact that you've given me a whole bunch of films that I'm going to go back to and rewatch. Because I mean, a film like Southern Comfort, I watched once when I was probably 13, 14. So
that'll mess your shit up, John. I'm just saying right now. That's a rough movie and great. Well, let's continue this conversation offline if you want. I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts about, even your further thoughts about first time watches of Hard Times and things like that. That's really, what's the word? It's really fulfilling to me to hear more people going to his work, perhaps just because I've talked about them a little bit. That's ultimately all you wish for, right? Is
Yeah,
somebody gives
yeah.
it a look. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, be safe out there.
So that was my conversation with Walter. We could have honestly gone on for hours, as you could probably tell from there were so many films we didn't cover in adequate depth. But I think we did what we could, and hopefully Walter will come back someday, and we'll have another conversation, because I think there's definitely more to be said about that this particular filmmaker, but also it'd be great to get Walter's opinions on other stuff as well. His recommended books were Walter Murch's In the Blink of an Eye and Sterling Hayden's Wanderer, two brilliant choices, one of which I'm definitely going to be hunting down because I haven't read it yet, which is Sterling Hayden's book. There was a great documentary about Sterling Hayden and his sort of boat years that showed at Cannes, and although I didn't actually see the film, I did see some material from it, and it looked really, really promising. I also met the filmmakers. The filmmakers were fascinating, and they talked about how they showed the documentary part of it to Sterling Hayden and his children, and how affected he was by it. So that's something that you might want to also follow up on. All that I have left to do now... no. All I should do now is... all that's left to do is thank Elliot Atkins for the music, Ali Harwood for the art, and thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Hopefully we'll be back next week, although over the Christmas period there might be some interruption to service. But hopefully we'll be back next week. Until then, take care.